The plasma cutter died with a final pathetic whimper, its energy cell drained after 3 hours of continuous use. Captain Mira Voss stared at the half-melted restraint around her left ankle, feeling the weight of failure settle in her chest. Like a stone, around her, the cargo hold of the hegemony transport ship Dominion's edge hummed with the sound of recycled air and distant engine vibrations. She wasn't alone in the darkness. 43 other human prisoners sat chained to the bulkheads, their faces gaunt from months of captivity. Most had given up weeks ago, their eyes vacant and hollow. But Mira could still see the ember of rage burning in a few. Dr. Elena Kastner, the xenobiologist who'd discovered the hegemony's biological weapons program, Marcus Greaves, the demolitions expert who'd turned 3 hegemony outposts into smoking craters, and young Kaio Kanquo, barely 19, who'd killed a hegemony interrogator with his bare hands after watching them execute his sister. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Mira felt her stomach lurch. Through the narrow viewport, she caught a glimpse of their destination, Zirion Prime, the hegemony's industrial capital, a world of strip mines and smelting facilities where human slaves worked themselves to death extracting rare minerals for their alien overlords. End of the line, Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from dehydration. Mira tested the plasma cutter's remaining charge, barely enough to warm metal, let alone cut through reinforced carbonite restraints. She'd been so close. If she had just one more hour, the cargo bay doors hissed open, flooding the hold with harsh artificial light. Hegemony soldiers poured in, tall, chitinous beings with multiple arms and compound eyes that reflected the light like black mirrors. Their species, the Vorthok, had conquered 17 systems in the past decade, enslaving or exterminating any species that resisted their expansion. "Rise, meet," barked Commander Thexala, the ship's security chief. His translator rendered the alien's clicking speech into cold, mechanical English. "Your new life begins now." As the soldiers began unlocking the chains that bound them to the walls, Mira felt something she hadn't experienced in months: opportunity. The Vorthok were methodical but overconfident. They'd grown comfortable with broken human prisoners who shuffled obediently to their deaths. They had no idea what humanity was truly capable of when pushed beyond the breaking point. Mira caught Elena's eye and saw understanding pass between them. The doctor's hand moved almost imperceptibly, revealing a small vial of synthesized compounds she'd been hiding for weeks, enzymes that could eat through organic compounds like Vorthok chitin. Marcus flexed his fingers, testing the improvised explosive device he'd crafted from discarded medical supplies and ship components. And Kai just smiled, the expression transforming his boyish features into something predatory. The Vorthok thought they were processing cargo. They were about to learn they'd brought apex predators into their nest. As Commander Thexala approached her restraints, Mira forced herself to slump forward, feigning the defeated posture the aliens expected. But inside, her mind was calculating angles, timing, and casualties. The other prisoners were watching her now. 39 broken humans suddenly finding fragments of hope in their captain's quiet defiance. The commander's chitinous fingers worked at her restraints, and Mira felt the weight around her ankles shift. Soon she would be free, not because the Vorthok intended it, but because they'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating what humans would do to survive. The chains that had held her for months weren't just restraints, they were weapons waiting to be claimed. And Mira Voss intended to reforge them into something the hegemony would never forget. The transport ship's engines powered down with a final shuddering breath, and through the viewport, Zirion Prime's industrial hellscape spread out below them like a mechanical cancer across the planet's surface. Somewhere in those foundries and mines, thousands of human slaves labored under the Vorthok whip. But not for much longer. The first Vorthok died before he even realized the human female was free. Mira's carbonite shackle, still attached to 6 feet of reinforced chain, whipped through the air and caught Commander Thexala across his compound eyes. With a wet cracking sound, chitin fragments scattered across the cargo bay floor as the alien's head snapped back, black ichor streaming from the ruined optical organs. Now Mira roared, and chaos erupted. Elena Kastner hurled her vial of synthesized enzymes at the nearest guard, the glass shattering against his thorax. The alien's exoskeleton began to smoke and bubble as the acidic compounds ate through his natural armor, exposing the soft tissue beneath. His screams sounded like grinding metal through the translator. Marcus Greaves' improvised explosive detonated in the center of the Vorthic formation, sending alien limbs and equipment flying. The concussive blast knocked 3 guards off their feet and cracked the cargo bay's main lighting panel, plunging half the space into flickering shadows. But it was Kaiokankwo who truly terrified them. The young man moved like liquid death, his chains becoming extensions of his body as he flowed between the confused aliens. A Vorthic soldier raised his plasma rifle, only to have Kai's restraints wrap around the weapon's barrel. The teenager pivoted, using the alien's own grip on the rifle to snap the creature's primary arm at the joint. Before the Vorthic could scream, Kai's elbow drove into the soft spot where head met thorax, crushing the neural cluster beneath. "Impossible," gasped a surviving guard, backing toward the exit. "Humans don't fight like this." Mira smiled as she wrapped her chain around another alien's throat, feeling the satisfying give of cartilage beneath her grip. "You've never seen humans fight for their lives." The battle lasted less than 3 minutes. When the last Vorthic stopped twitching, 43 humans stood free in a cargo hold painted with alien blood. But their celebration with short-lived. Alarms were already blaring throughout the ship, and Mira could hear the thunder of reinforcements approaching. "Elena, get to the medical bay and synthesize more of that acid," Mira ordered, her tactical mind already shifting into command mode. "Marcus, engineering section, I need the ship's weapons and defensive systems under our control. Kai, take 6 people and secure the bridge." "What about you, Captain?" Elena asked, already moving toward the corridor. Mira hefted her bloodied chain and looked at the remaining prisoners, people who'd been written off as dead by both sides of this war. "I'm going to send a message to every Vorthic on this ship. They wanted to see what humans become when you chain us up and drag us to hell." She stepped over Commander Thexala's corpse, her boots squelching in the spreading pool of alien blood. "They're about to find out." The ship's corridors echoed with the sound of running feet as Vorthic soldiers converged on their position. Mira could see the fear in her people's eyes. Months of captivity had worn them down to raw nerve and desperate hope. But underneath that fear, she saw something else, the cold fury that only humans seemed capable of sustaining. Across generations of conflict, the Vorthic had made one critical error in their assessment of human psychology. They'd assumed that breaking their bodies would break their spirits. Instead, they'd created something far worse than soldiers. They'd created survivors with nothing left to lose. The first wave of reinforcements rounded the corner at a dead run, plasma rifles charging with that distinctive whine that meant death was coming. But Mira was already moving, her chain singing through the air as she led her ragged band of prisoners into battle against their captors. Behind her, she heard Marcus Greaves laugh as he triggered another improvised explosive. The sound sent chills down her spine because she recognized it. It was the same sound she'd heard from human soldiers just before they did something that would give their enemies nightmares for generations. The Vorthic had expected them to die in chains. They were about to learn what happened when you gave humans time to get creative with their restraints. The Dominion's edge had become a slaughterhouse. Mira pressed herself against the bulkhead as plasma fire scorched the air, where her head had been moments before. 3 decks down, she could hear Marcus's explosives detonating in sequence, each blast followed by the inhuman shrieking of dying Vorthic. The ship's gravity fluctuated wildly as damaged systems struggled to compensate for the structural damage. "Captain," Kai's voice crackled through the stolen comm unit. "Bridge is ours, but they've activated the ship's lockdown protocol. Emergency blast doors are sealing throughout the vessel." Mira cursed as she heard the telltale hiss of emergency barriers deploying. The Vorthic were trying to compartmentalize the ship, trapping the humans in individual sections where they could be eliminated piecemeal. It was a sound tactical decision, one she would have made herself. "Elena, report." She barked into the comm while dodging another volley of plasma bolts. "Medical bay is secure." "But I've got bad news," came the reply. "The ship's manifest shows 200 Vorthic crew members. We've maybe killed 30. The math was brutal and simple. 43 humans against 170 alien soldiers, trapped aboard a ship they didn't fully understand, with limited weapons and no chance of outside help. Any reasonable commander would be looking for surrender terms. Mira had never been accused of being reasonable. She keyed the comm to ship-wide broadcast and spoke in the clicking, chittering language she'd learned during her months of captivity. "Attention, crew of the Dominion's Edge. This is Captain Mira Voss of the Terran Liberation Front. Your security chief is dead. Your cargo is free, and your ship now belongs to us." The alien voices that responded were filled with outrage and disbelief. But Mira caught something else underneath uncertainty. Good. Uncertainty led to mistakes, and mistakes got aliens killed. "You are 43 meat creatures against 200 superior beings," came the reply from what sounded like the ships. "Captain, surrender now and your deaths will be swift." Mira smiled as she readied her chain for another assault. "Counteroffer. Surrender your ship and I'll let some of you live long enough to tell the hegemony." What happened here? The response was predictable. More plasma fire, more alien battle cries, more attempts to overwhelm their positions through superior numbers. But the Vorthok were learning the same lesson that had broken a dozen other species. Who'd underestimated humanity? Superior numbers meant nothing when facing an enemy that refused to die. Dr. Elena Kastner had turned the medical bay into a chemical weapons laboratory, synthesizing compounds that ate through Vorthok armor like acid through paper. Every breath the aliens took in the ship's recycled atmosphere now carried traces of her creations, slowly weakening their exoskeletons and burning their respiratory systems. Marcus Greaves had rewired half the ship's systems, turning maintenance tunnels into death traps and causing power conduits to overload. Whenever Vorthok soldiers tried to use them, the aliens were beginning to fear their own vessel, jumping at shadows and checking every corner for improvised explosives and Kaiokonquo. Kai had become something that gave even Mira pause. The young man moved through the ship's corridors like a ghost, appearing behind Vorthok patrols to kill silently with nothing but his chains and an intimate knowledge of alien anatomy. His body count had reached 15 and was climbing, but it wasn't enough. For every alien they killed, two more seemed to take its place. The Vorthok were adapting, coordinating their attacks, using their superior knowledge of the ship's layout to corner isolated groups of humans. "Captain," Marcus's voice came through static and interference. "They've got us pinned in engineering. I can trigger a catastrophic overload of the main reactor." But negative, Mira cut him off. "We need the ship intact." She ducked as another plasma bolt seared past her ear, the heat close enough to singe her hair. Round her, 5 other humans crouched behind improvised barricades, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were running out of ammunition and options. The Vorthok were closing in from 3 directions, their disciplined advance cutting off escape routes with military precision. In minutes, this corridor would become a killing ground. But Mira wasn't looking at the tactical situation. She was looking at the chains still wrapped around her ankles, at the similar restraints worn by every human aboard the ship. 43 sets of carbonite shackles, each one forged to contain a single prisoner, each one a weapon that could kill in the right hands. "All units, this is Voss." She whispered into the comm. "New orders. Stop fighting like escaped prisoners." She stood up, exposing herself to alien fire as she began spinning her chain in a deadly arc, the heavy links whizzing through the air. "Start fighting like what we really are." The confused voices of her people came through the comm, but Mira was already moving, her chain lashing out to catch the nearest Vorthok across the throat. As the alien fell, she continued her broadcast, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd finally understood the true nature of their situation. "We're not prisoners anymore. We're not even soldiers." Another alien died, his compound, eyes crushed by the brutal impact of forged carbonite. "We're the nightmare every conqueror creates when they push too far." The Dominion's Edge shuddered as Mira led her people through the ship's central hub, their chains now singing a symphony of death. What had begun as a desperate escape had transformed into something far more terrifying. A systematic hunting expedition. "Elena, status on the atmospheric processors." Mira ordered, as she stepped over the corpse of a Vorthic communications officer, his thorax crushed by the weighted links that had once held her prisoner. Fully compromised, came the reply from the medical bay. My compounds are breaking down their respiratory systems from the inside. Every breath they take is poison now. The tactical shift had been brutal in its simplicity. Instead of trying to fight like conventional soldiers, Mira had ordered her people to embrace what the Vorthic had made them, predators forged by suffering and refined by desperation. They moved through the ship like cancer through tissue, killing methodically and leaving psychological scars as deep as physical ones. Kai appeared from a maintenance shaft, his young face spattered with alien blood. Crew quarters secured. Captain, found their personal weapons cache. He held up a Vorthic plasma rifle. Its organic curves designed for chitinous fingers doesn't fit human hands perfectly, but it'll kill just fine. Mira nodded and keyed her comm. Marcus, report from engineering. Beautiful. Carnage down here, came the demolitions expert's voice, tinged with dark satisfaction. Rig the power distribution network to overload on command. When they try to coordinate their next assault, half their equipment will fry. The ship's intercom crackled to life, and Captain Zethamer's voice filled the corridors, speaking in rapid Vorthic. Mira had learned enough of their language during captivity to understand the gist that aliens were beginning to panic. Their casualty reports spoke of impossible things, humans moving through solid walls, poison that ate through environmental suits, explosions that defied their understanding of chemistry and physics. They were learning what every species eventually discovered about humanity. We were our most dangerous when we had nothing left to lose. New contacts, Elena's voice came through, strained with exhaustion. 20 Vorthic moving through Section C, heading for the bridge. Mira smiled grimly. The aliens were finally making the mistake she'd been waiting for, concentrating their forces for a decisive assault. It would have been the correct tactical decision against any other species. Against humans, it was suicide. Kai, take 15 people and intercept them in the central corridor. Marcus, I need those power overloads on my mark. She hefted her chain, feeling the familiar weight of forged carbonite. Everyone else, with me, it's time to show these aliens what we learned in their prison camps. The battle that followed would haunt Vorthic military doctrine for decades. Mira's group hit the alien formation from above, dropping through ventilation shafts with chains whirling. The confined space of the corridor worked against the Vorthic, their superior numbers meaningless when they couldn't bring their weapons to bear. Without hitting their own forces, Elena's chemical weapons had weakened their exoskeletons to the point where human strength could crack chitin like eggshells. Marcus's sabotage turned their own ship against them, overloading plasma conduits in showers of sparks and toxic gas. And the humans themselves had become something beyond the Vorthic's comprehension. Not soldiers following orders, but survivors who'd learned to kill with whatever came to hand. The sound of combat echoed through the ship's corridors, the wet crack of chitin breaking, the hiss of dissolving armor, the wet thud of bodies hitting deck plates. But underneath it all was something worse, the sound of human laughter, as they repaid months of torment with methodical violence. Enough. Captain Zethamer's voice boomed through the intercom, switching to accented English. We surrender to the human forces. The words echoed through suddenly quiet corridors. Mira stood over the body of a Vorthic gunner, her chain dripping with black ichor, and felt the moment stretch like a held breath. Round her, 38 humans waited for her command. They'd lost 5 in the fighting, but those deaths had been paid for in alien blood. She keyed the ship-wide comm and spoke in clear, calm English. Captain Zethamer, this is Captain Voss. Your surrender is noted and rejected. The silence that followed was deafening. You want to know what you created when you chained us up and dragged us to hell. Mira continued. You want to understand what humans become when you push us beyond breaking. She looked at her people, no longer prisoners, no longer even truly human in the way they'd been before their captivity. They'd been reforged in alien prison cells, tempered by suffering and honed by desperation into something new. We become the consequences of your actions. The hunt resumed with renewed intensity. The Vorthic who'd thought surrender would save them learned that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. The humans had moved beyond concepts like mercy or military honor into something far more primitive and infinitely more terrifying. They had become evolution in action, apex predators adapted to an environment of absolute brutality. The Dominion's edge would reach Xerion Prime, but not as its captors had intended. Instead, it would arrive as a testament to what happened when you gave humans time to think about revenge. The final assault began when Captain Zethima realized surrender was not an option. All units, converge on Central Hub. The Vorthic captain's voice crackled through their secure channels, speaking in rapid clicks that Mira had learned to interpret. Explosive charges authorized. Destroy the humans and seal the breach. Mira crouched behind an overturned cargo container as plasma fire turned the air around her into superheated hell. The ship's central hub had become a killing ground, a spherical chamber 30 meters across, with multiple access points that the Vorthic were using to pour in reinforcements. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the deck plates were slick with blood from both species. Elena, how many are we facing? She shouted over the sound of weapons fire. Motion sensors show 87 active Vorthic signatures. Converging on our position, came the reply from their makeshift command post. They're coming from 6 different directions. The numbers were impossible. 38 humans against nearly 90 alien soldiers, fighting in a space that offered minimal cover and no retreat. Any military academy would have classified it as a suicide mission. Mira keyed her calm and switched to the frequency used by her scattered teams. All units, this is Voss. They're making their final push. Remember what I told you, we're not trying to win a battle. We're writing a message that the galaxy will never forget. The response that came back wasn't words, it was the sound of human voices, raised in something between a war cry and a death song, echoing through the ship's corridors as her people prepared for what might be their last fight. Marcus Greaves was the first to break cover, emerging from behind a blast door with a Vorthic plasma cannon he'd somehow managed to rip from its mounting. The weapon was never designed for human hands, but desperation had made him adapt. His first shot took out an entire alien squad, turning for Vorthic into expanding clouds of superheated vapor. That's for Lieutenant Morrison, he screamed, referring to a comrade who died in the prison camps. His second shot punched through a bulkhead and killed 3 more aliens in the corridor beyond. That's for Sergeant Hayes. But the Vorthic adapted quickly. Overlapping fields of fire forced Marcus back into cover, and Mira watched as plasma bolts chewed through his improvised barricade. He lasted another 30 seconds before a lucky shot found its mark, burning through his chest and dropping him to the deck plates. His death seemed to trigger something primal in the remaining humans. Elena Kastner abandoned her defensive position and charged into the alien formation, her improvised chemical grenades turning Vorthic armor into smoking ruins. She killed 6 before they brought her down, her body riddled with plasma burns, but her face locked an expression of savage satisfaction. Kai Okonkwo moved like liquid death through the chaos, his chains having evolved from improvised weapons into extensions of his will. He'd abandoned any pretense of defensive fighting, instead flowing between alien positions to kill at close range, where their superior weapons were useless. A Vorthic officer managed to get a clean shot at his center mass, but Kai kept fighting, even as his blood painted the deck, killing 2 more aliens before finally collapsing. One by one, Mira's people fell. Jenkins, who'd rigged the ship's atmospheric systems to become a delivery system for Elena's poison. Okafor, who'd turned the cargo bays into explosive death traps. Petrov, who'd somehow learned to pilot Vorthic combat drones and turned them against their makers. Each death bought time, space, and opportunity for the survivors to exact a higher price from their enemies. But the Vorthic were dying in numbers. That would have been unthinkable at the start of the engagement. Their superior technology and training meant nothing when facing humans, who fought like cancer-given consciousness. Every alien who died weakened their formation, broke their communication lines, and fed the growing panic that was beginning to spread through their ranks. Impossible. Mira heard one alien officer clicking to another. The prisoners are fighting like humans, another voice replied. And in those words Mira heard something she'd never expected: respect. Battle reached its crescendo when Captain Zethamer himself entered the hub, wielding a heavy plasma cannon and leading the last 30 Vorthic soldiers aboard the ship. His compound eyes fixed on Mira, recognizing her as the source of their catastrophe. "You." He clicked, his translator rendering the words with deadly precision. "This ends now." Mira stood up from behind her cover, her chain coiled around her arm like a steel serpent. Around her, 12 humans remained standing bloodied, exhausted, but still fighting. Behind the Vorthic captain, 30 alien soldiers raised their weapons. In perfect synchronization. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." The final exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Plasma fire and human fury met in the center of the chamber, and when the light faded, the deck was littered with bodies from both species. Mira looked around at the carnage, at the friends who'd died to reach this moment, at the aliens who'd learned too late what it meant to cage a human. 7 of her people were still breathing, including herself. On the Vorthic side, Captain Zethamer knelt among his dead crew, ichor streaming from wounds that should have killed him. "Why?" he whispered, his translator struggling with the damage to his vocal apparatus. "You could have surrendered. You could have lived as slaves." Mira walked over to where he knelt, her chain dragging behind her, and looked down at the alien who'd commanded their prison ship. "Because," she said simply, "humans don't know how to quit." She raised her chain for the killing blow, but Zethamer held up one trembling appendage. "Wait," he gasped, "the other ships, the rest of the fleet, they need to know what you are." Mira paused, considering his words. Around them, the Dominion's edge continued its course toward Zirian Prime, where thousands of human slaves waited for rescue. "Yes," she said finally, "they do." The Dominion's edge dropped out of hyperspace above Zirian Prime like a harbinger of apocalypse. Mira stood on the bridge, her reflection ghost-like in the viewport that showed the industrial hellscape below. The planet's surface was a patchwork of strip mines and smelting facilities, their fires visible even from orbit. Somewhere in those foundries, human slaves were dying by the thousands, worked to death extracting the rare minerals that fueled the Vorthic war machine. Behind her, Captain Zethamer sat chained to a command chair, not with carbonite restraints, but with the very chains that had once held her prisoner. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Incoming transmission from Orbital Defense Platform 7, reported Tomas Reyes, one of the 6 humans still able to function after the battle in the central hub. His left arm hung useless at his side, but his fingers still worked the alien communication systems with grim efficiency." "Put it through," Mira ordered. The holoscreen flickered to life, showing a Vorthic admiral whose compound eyes reflected the bridge lighting like black mirrors. "Transport Dominion's edge. You are 3 hours overdue for your delivery schedule. Explain your delay." Mira stepped into the hologram's pickup range, her blood-stained clothing and the chain still wrapped around her arm telling its own story. "Admiral, this is Captain Mira Voss of the Terran Liberation Front. Your transport and its crew now belong to us." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 10 seconds before the Admiral's translator began working again. "Impossible. Security protocols indicate no boarding action. Your security protocols didn't account for what humans become when you give us time to think about revenge." Mira interrupted. She gestured to Captain Zethamer, who sat bound and broken in his own command chair. "Ask your captain. Ask him what he learned about our species today." Zethamer raised his head with visible effort. "Admiral Crystal," he clicked weakly. "The humans, they are not what we believed. They fight like nothing in our databases. They turn our own ship systems against us. They make weapons from restraints. They..." His voice trailed off, and when he spoke again, there was something approaching awe in his alien tones. "They refuse to die." Admiral Crystal's image flickered as he consulted with officers outside the pickup range. When he returned his attention to the screen, his posture had shifted from confusion to cold military calculation. "1 ship," he said dismissively. 7 humans against the orbital defenses of an entire world. You have achieved nothing except to die slightly later than scheduled." Mira smiled, and the expression sent visible ripples of unease through the alien crew visible in the background of the transmission. "Admiral, you're making the same mistake your captain made. "You're thinking like a conqueror," she gestured to the tactical display showing Xerion Prime's defensive grid orbital platforms bristling with weapons. Patrol squadrons of fighter craft, ground-based ion cannons that could crack a moon. It was a fortress that had repelled 3 separate Terran fleet actions over the past 2 years. "We're not here to conquer anything," Mira continued. "We're here to send a message." Her hand moved to the ship's communication panel, switching to a wideband broadcast that would reach every human slave on the planet's surface. When she spoke, her voice carried across 1,000 work camps and mining facilities, reaching ears that had forgotten the sound of their own language. "My name is Captain Mira Voss. I am human. I was a prisoner aboard this ship, chained like an animal and destined for your world to die in your minds." She paused, letting the words sink in across the planet below. "But I am not in chains anymore, and neither will you be." The response was immediate and electric. Emergency lights began flashing on the planet's surface as human slaves people, who'd been written off as dead by both sides, began to move. Work camps that had been quiet for years suddenly erupted into chaos as prisoners realized that someone had broken free, someone had fought back, someone had won. "Impossible," Admiral Crystal breathed. "We have 1,000,000 humans in custody. You cannot. We don't need to free them all." Mira said quietly, "We just need to show them it's possible." The first explosion came from Mining Complex 7, where human prisoners had somehow gained access to industrial explosives. The second followed moments later, from a smelting facility on the southern continent. By the time the third detonation lit up the night sky, it was clear that the planet's carefully controlled slave population was in open revolt. "This is Admiral Crystal to all orbital defense platforms," the alien commander snapped, switching to military frequencies. "Target the transport vessel. Destroy it immediately." But Mira had been expecting this. Her hand found the control that Marcus Greaves had rigged before his death, a dead man's switch, connected to the Dominion's Edge's reactor core. "Admiral," she said calmly, "I should mention that this ship is now essentially a flying bomb. My people rigged the reactor to overload on my command. If you destroy us, the explosion will take out your 3 nearest orbital platforms and rain radioactive debris across your primary industrial centers." She leaned forward, her reflection multiplying in the Admiral's compound eyes. "But more importantly, every human slave on this planet is watching right now. They're waiting to see what happens when their own people finally fight back." Crystal's image wavered as his bridge erupted in urgent consultations. Mira could hear fragments of their discussions: evacuation protocols, damage assessments, casualty projections. The Vorthok were learning the hardest lesson any conquering species could face. Controlling a population required their consent, however grudging, and humanity had just withdrawn that consent. "What do you want?" Crystal finally asked. Mira looked at Captain Zethamer, still chained to his command chair with the bonds that had once held her prisoner. Then she looked at the tactical display showing a planet in revolt, millions of humans who'd been forgotten by their own species suddenly remembering what it meant to be free. "I want you to remember this moment," she said. "I want you to remember that 43 humans broke free from your prison ship, killed most of its crew, and sparked a revolution that your fleet can't stop." The first human transport began launching from the planet's surface, improvised spacecraft, built from mining equipment and stolen shuttle parts, carrying refugees toward the outer system. The Vorthok fighter squadrons moved to intercept, but Mira's broadcast had reached the human slave workers in the orbital shipyards as well. Explosions began cascading through the defense platforms as sabotage rippled through the fleet. "I want you to remember," Mira continued, "that we were supposed to die in chains." She raised the carbonite shackle that still encircled her wrist, its surface now stained with alien blood. "Instead, we reforged them into a throne." 6 months later, Mira Voss stood before the Terran Senate, her testimony broadcast across every human world in known space. The hearing chamber was packed with representatives from colonies that had been fighting the Vorthok for over a decade, military officials whose strategies had failed to make a dent in the hegemony's expansion, and families of the millions who'd been taken as slaves. All of them had come to hear the story of the Dominions, Edge and the 43 prisoners who'd changed the course of a war. The Zirian Prime incident, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems, began as an escape attempt and became something far larger. What we accomplished wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a demonstration of what human beings are capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. On the massive display screen behind her, images flickered showing the aftermath of that day. The Dominion's Edge had never reached Zirian Prime's surface. Mira had detonated the reactor core, while still in orbit, turning the ship into a brief star that lit up the planet's sky. But the message had already been delivered. By the time the explosion faded, 17 Vorthic orbital platforms were in ruins, destroyed by human saboteurs who'd spent years learning their captors' weaknesses. More importantly, the planet's slave population had risen in coordinated revolt. Mining facilities that had operated for decades suddenly went dark as human prisoners seized control of their operations. Transport ships that had been commandeered by desperate slaves scattered to every corner of human space, carrying stories of what had happened aboard the hegemony vessel. The psychological impact, continued General Harrison, the Senate's military advisor, cannot be overstated. For 10 years, the Vorthic have presented themselves as an unstoppable force. The Zirian Prime incident shattered that image across dozens of systems. Senator Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her expression grave. Captain Voss, our intelligence reports suggest the Vorthic hegemony has recalled 3 entire fleets from their expansion fronts. Their slave operations have been suspended indefinitely. How do you explain such a dramatic response to what was, objectively, a single ship? Mira touched the carbonite bracelet she still wore, the only remaining piece of her original shackles. Polished smooth and inscribed with the names of the 36 people who died aboard the Dominio. Ends Edge, Senator, the Vorthic aren't just dealing with military casualties. They're facing something far worse, the realization that their entire economic model is built on a foundation that can collapse overnight. She gestured to the display, which now showed refugee camps across human space, filled with former slaves who'd escaped during the chaos. Every human they've enslaved over the past decade now knows that resistance is possible. Every Vorthic overseer has to sleep knowing that the beings they consider inferior have killed trained soldiers with improvised weapons. The images shifted to show intercepted Vorthic communications, alien officers reporting discipline problems, work stoppages, and what their translators rendered as inexplicable human defiance behaviors. They're not just facing a military defeat, Mira continued. They're facing the knowledge that they fundamentally misunderstood what they were trying to conquer. Admiral Chen, representing the Terran Defense Force, stood to address the chamber. Captain Voss's actions have given us our first major strategic advantage in this conflict. Vorthic fleet movements have become defensive, focused on protecting their existing holdings rather than expanding their territory. For the first time since the war began, we're seeing them react to our initiatives rather than the reverse. But it was Dr. Sarah Kim, a Xenop psychologist who'd studied Vorthic behavior for years, who provided the most telling analysis. The hegemony operates on a principle of absolute dominance. Their entire society is built around the concept that superior technology and organization make them naturally suited to rule other species. What happened aboard the Dominion's Edge challenges that worldview at its foundation. She activated a holographic display showing Vorthic social structures. When 43 inferior humans can seize control of a hegemony warship, using nothing but improvised weapons and tactical thinking, it suggests that their assumptions about natural hierarchy are fundamentally flawed. This has created what we can only describe as an existential crisis within their command structure. Mira nodded slowly. She'd seen that crisis firsthand in Captain Zethamer's eyes during those final moments, the dawning realization that everything his species believed about conquest and control was built on a lie. The real victory, she said quietly, wasn't taking the ship. It was showing them that humans don't break the way they expected. We don't become compliant when you chain us up. We become dangerous. Senator Rodriguez raised his hand. Captain, what's your assessment of current Vorthic vulnerabilities? How do we press this advantage? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the chamber knew that Mira Voss had become something unique in human space, a person who'd seen the Vorthik from the inside, who'd lived among them as a prisoner and emerged as their conqueror. The hegemony's greatest weakness, she said finally, is the same as their greatest strength. They're methodical, predictable, and absolutely convinced of their own superiority. They can't adapt to an enemy that refuses to follow their rules. She stood up, her movement drawing every eye in the chamber. But our advantage goes deeper than tactics. The Vorthik enslave other species because they genuinely believe those species are inferior. When we prove them wrong, when we show that humans can outfight, outthink, and outlast them, we're not just winning battles. We're destroying the philosophical foundation of their entire civilization. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a war for territory or resources. It was a conflict between two fundamentally different visions of what intelligent life could become. The chains they used to bind us, Mira continued, raising her bracelet so the light caught. The engraved names were forged from their assumptions about what we are. When we broke free, we didn't just escape those chains, we proved that their assumptions were wrong from the beginning. She looked around the chamber at the faces of representatives from dozens of human worlds, people who'd lived in fear of Vorthik expansion for over a decade. That's why they've recalled their fleets. That's why their slave operations have collapsed. They're not just fighting a military campaign anymore, they're fighting for the right to believe in their own superiority. Admiral Chen stood again. What are your recommendations for our next phase of operations, Captain? Mira smiled, and several senators visibly shivered at the expression. It was the same smile she'd worn in the final moments aboard the Dominions, edged the look of someone who'd discovered exactly how far human determination could push the boundaries of possibility. We keep showing them what humans are really capable of, she said simply. Every slave camp they've established, every world they've conquered, every assumption they've made about our species, we prove them wrong, one victory at a time. The session ended with a standing ovation, but Mira barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the bracelet around her wrist and the names engraved there: Elena Kastner, Marcus Greaves, Kaio Conquo, and 33 others who'd died to deliver a single, devastating message to an alien empire. They'd expected her to die in chains. Instead, she'd reforged those chains into something that would topple worlds, a throne built from the wreckage of alien assumptions about human nature, and a legacy that would burn bright across the galaxy for generations to come. The war was far from over, but the Vorthik hegemony would never again make the mistake of underestimating what humans could accomplish when they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In the end, that might be the most human thing of all: the ability to transform our worst moments into our greatest weapons, and to build tomorrow's victories from today's chains.